Sorry about that, everybody. Uh, Not sure what the hell just happened right there. If you're still here, thanks for sticking around. Uh, that was kind of weird. Not sure what the fuck just happened there. Everything just kind of froze up. Yeah, uh, everything just locked up. I couldn't use my mouse. I couldn't use the keyboard. I couldn't do anything. It wouldn't. No mic. No audio, no nothing there. The ghost took over and decided it didn't want me to stream anything. So if you're still here, thanks for sticking around. Uh if you disappeared, that's okay. I completely understand. I'm gonna do a quick check
times for the church.
and make sure everything's still connected.
You're just a fat kid. Sorry about that, fatty. Tom, he's just a fat kid. Aren't you, fatty? You're just a big old fat kid. Here's some chocolate, fatso.
Okay, that's still connected. Make sure Streamlabs is still on. Give me some F's in chat if you're still awake and still here.
I've never said this, but don't swallow.
This is a test bit alert for.
Okay, that's working. That was kind of weird. Uh, can't really say nothing about that. That was kind of fucked up. Okay, now I got my double audio going. God damn it. It always does that shit to me. What the fuck? Okay, well, seem to have everything back. Let me know if you guys are still here. I don't know if anybody's in here still, but Yeah, stream died. Crashed out on me. I don't know what the hell that was all about. Very weird. Um, I'll just keep going up towards Delhi. And we will restore the story, and it'll carry on where it froze up at. Smurl family poltergeist.
As if on cue and knowing the Smurls were trying to get rid of it, this entity stepped up its game. On separate occasions, every single family member, including the dog, were harmed in some way physically. They had been slapped, scratched, and bitten. One night when Jack was sleeping, he woke up to a creepy old lady standing over him, red eyes and a rotted out mouth, touching him. He grabbed his rosary beads and began to pray. That's when he was violently dragged out of his bed. And Janet, in a later interview, would go on to say, "I know what people must think, that we're crazy, but 8 people live in this house. 8 people have experienced this. 8 people are not crazy."
Are you sure they're not
At this point, you
crazy?
might be asking, well, why didn't they just move out and be done with this? Clearly, this entity is angry you moved in, maybe even pissed off by the changes you made with what they consider to be their house. So, just get up and go. Well, it wasn't that easy. For one, the Smurls were struggling a bit financially. Remember, they had lost all their belongings in the hurricane, and those needed to be replaced. They bought a new house and made renovations, so it wasn't that easy. On top of that, they said that this spirit was no longer attached to the house. It was now attached to the family itself. In an effort to get away for some time and find a little moment of peace, Jack and Janet had packed up the family in a camper to go out and spend some time in the woods for a long weekend. While out there, they claimed to have seen a dark and hazy entity, while also reporting that they heard loud banging noises coming from the top of their camper. Now, whatever this force was, it shook the entire vehicle violently. The Smurls were desperate, and eventually got word through some of their church friends about a couple that might be able to help them out. It was Ed and Lorraine Warren, who'd been slowly gaining attention for their work and ridding other people of dangerous spirits. Ed was a demonologist, and Lorraine a clairvoyant. Both of them were Roman Catholics, so they aligned there. And they had founded the New England Society for Psychic Research back in 1952. Their main purpose was to investigate paranormal activity. In some cases they found were false, but others were anything but. The Smurl family poltergeist was one of those. A preliminary check inside the home led the Warrens to believe there was in fact something to the stories that the family was telling. But it wasn't just what they found, but also the demeanor the entire family gave. The Smurls were terrified and lost at what to do. All 8 members were scared, and these were honest folks by all accounts, and so why would they all just conjure up some fantastical story like this? So in 1986, the Warrens, along with psychic Rosemary Frew, essentially lived in the house on Chase Street for 8 months in order to properly investigate the family's claims. By the end, they declared that the home was haunted by 3 minor spirits and a powerful evil demon. Ed said, "There's something in this home which has the intelligence to inflict physical and psychological harm upon this family. The only way I've seen anyone get rid of something like this is through exorcism. And there is a powerful, intangible, invisible force here."
Need to
Why the
find
family was
a
targeted exactly was unclear,
weapon
but
cleaning
it
kit.
was believed that likely these spirits were dormant and were only awakened by the move-in of the Smurls. Lorraine believes the energy brought about by the 4 daughters going through puberty was something the forces clung onto to gain power. The Warrens tried to bring the spirits and demon to the forefront once and for all so they could expel them, but when they failed, they sought the expertise of Father Robert McKenna, who was a Vatican-mandated exorcist. By this time, the media had gotten word, with various outlets camping close to the Smurls' property to try and catch their story, although the family hated that attention. Nosy neighbors would cruise up and down past their house, and people even attempted to break in on a few occasions to try and experience the spirits themselves. It was chaos, and Father McKenna would go on to perform 2 exorcisms inside the home, dousing it with holy water and condemning the spirits to leave, but this only enraged them even more, and things continued to go downhill for the Smurls. With the media frenzy ramping up, the Scranton Diocese decided to finally get involved and sent a priest of their own to investigate. He spent several months there, but claimed to have experienced nothing. Of this, Janet Smurl explained that the demon hid when these figures were around. Hence why Father McKenna and the Warrens and this priest were unable to bring it out. This info, media outlets were now questioning more than siding with the Smurls, which hurt them tremendously. They had never asked for any of this. They didn't want the press. Their lives were being tortured by these demons, and now, once respected community members were becoming pariahs, a sideshow, so to speak, who have been labeled as liars among their peers. And Father McKenna would come in and perform a 3rd exorcism. It appeared to calm things down for a few months for the family. But the criticism from experts and others was relentless. Many claim that the Smurls had drummed up the story in an attempt to make money off it, although it's unclear if they ever actually did. Their story would be told in various books and a movie called The Haunted, which was made in 1991 about the experience, but none were written by the Smurls themselves. Although they perhaps got paid something on the side to share their story, it's unknown.
Y'all need to calm down.
Eventually, the Smurls couldn't take the negative attention anymore and moved from Chase Street in 1987. They say the activity followed them to their new house until a church-sanctioned exorcism was performed, at which point the Smurls were finally freed of whatever this entity was. The people that moved into Chase Street after them never reported experiencing anything paranormal, although I guess they would have if the entity stuck with the Smurls. John, Jack's father, passed away in 1990. His mother Mary died in 1995. And Jack would go on to pass away in 2017 after complications from diabetes.
Diabetes.
As a side note, Ed and Lorraine Warren never charged families that they were investigating, although they did themselves make money off their experiences in various ways. But what about that angle with the Smurls? Without having been there, looking in from the outside, everyone's going to have their opinion about whether or not the Smurls' haunting actually happened. If money and fame were the ultimate motive, well, they didn't really do a good job of exploiting the insane tale they completely fabricated in order to get there. If this were one big lie, they did the hard work of getting the attention they needed, but right when they could have struck gold, they just walked away. They told reporters to leave them alone rather than drumming up more press. While they may have gotten paid on the side in a sort of consulting job so people could write their books and scripts, they certainly could have made more. So other than fame and fortune, what's the reason to make this up?
There isn't one.
It's hard to come up with a reason, so maybe it's possible that all this was real. Across every single culture and religion, you'll find stories about spirits, demons, and possession. So, is it more likely that they're all just made up, or do they come from some form of truth? An experience that perhaps a family had that is unexplained, yet did, in fact, happen. So that's it for this week's episode of Every Town. Thanks for tuning in today. Please do subscribe so you don't miss out on all the content we're putting out each and every week. Remember to come back next week for another episode filled with scary, strange, and mysterious. Every 1965, Dark Side. On a sweltering summer day in June of 1965, Houston police officers responded to a welfare check at a home in the city's neighborhood of Montrose. An elderly couple who had lived there for years hadn't been seen or heard from in a few days, and so the authorities headed on over to the modest, yellow brick house, not really expecting anything too out of the ordinary. However, what they walked into would become nothing short of one of the most disturbing crime scenes ever in American history. Hey guys, it's Andrew. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Every Town. For today, we're turning back the clock a little bit, but for good reason. Because this case isn't just another unsolved mystery. It's a crime that was ruthless and is shrouded in secrecy, possible government cover-ups, and one very smart.
Looks like a dried up dog
So
turd.
let's head on down to Houston and check out the case of the Icebox murders.
Well, tonight's case from the text files is a bizarre murder mystery.
One filled with intrigue, allegations of CIA connections. Some even have tried to tie it to the Kennedy assassination. It's the case of the Icebox murders.
In order to really grasp how someone like Charles Rogers could possibly commit such a gruesome crime and then disappear without a trace, you need to understand who he was at his time. And his father, one of the victims, Fred, was born on January 19th of 1884 in the aftermath of America's Gilded Age. By the time he reached adulthood, he had established himself as a real estate salesman in Houston, Texas. However, underneath that cover of respectability, Fred was also a man who dabbled in some not-so-legal things. And back then, Texas was still kind of the Wild West, so it makes sense. And Fred worked as a bookie, as a side hustle, regularly engaging in illegal gambling operations and various insurance fraud schemes. And those who knew him would later describe Fred as a devious con artist, a man who had a talent for manipulating both strangers and family members alike. On October 8th of 1892, Edwina Ivor was born. She would later become Mrs. Rogers, but like her future husband, she wasn't quite what she appeared to be on the surface. While she maintained the appearance of a well-maintained and proper Houston housewife, Edwina was reportedly just as cunning as Fred when it came to financial manipulation and scheming. Together, they would create a household that appeared normal enough, but truly harbored some deep dysfunction within. A place where family members didn't interact with one another in a loving and nurturing way. And this was the environment that Charles was born and raised in. Fred and Edwina settled into Houston's Montrose neighborhood. They would purchase the house at 1815 Driscoll Street. That's where they would spend their lives to a very violent end. As they got older, I'm talking in their 70s and 80s, Fred could often be seen collecting old newspapers from the neighbors' trash cans. And supposedly he did this to sell them for a little bit of extra cash, so even in his old age, he was always doing some sort of hustle to make some extra money. And Edwina maintained a quiet presence, keeping mostly to herself inside the home, but remained cordial with those in the neighborhood that she saw. And their lifestyle habits may have seemed a bit odd, especially for a former real estate salesman like Fred, but ultimately nothing they did raised any serious alarms. They were just another quiet retired couple getting on through life. When their son Charles was born in 1921, right from the beginning it was clear that he was a bit different from the other children, and not in a bad way. He was quite brilliant, showing exceptional intelligence from an early age, but also withdrawn socially. While most of the neighborhood kids were playing outside, he chose to remain in his room, reading and studying, just keeping to himself. He was described as being reclusive, reportedly communicated with his parents by way of notes being slipped under the doors. And clearly that's no proper way for a kid to live, but not all parents are equipped to deal with certain aspects of their children, and so they just let that be the way that they taught. After all, Charles was getting straight A's, so how bad could things really be? He would go on to pursue higher education at a time when many Americans didn't even finish high school. But growing up without a social life would leave some serious marks on Charles's psyche, creating patterns of behavior that would persist throughout his life. His academic journey started at Texas A&M in 1942, but it wasn't the right fit for him there. He dropped out and then enrolled at the University of Houston, where he would eventually earn a degree in nuclear physics. And so, that's the type of smarts this guy had. A long time before computers and calculators were there to help assist with such intense and difficult subject matter, well, Charles could seemingly handle it all. The early 1940s were a transformative time in American history, and Rogers would play his part. Like many young men of his generation, he answered the call to serve in World War II, but his role was far from ordinary. With his technical background and big brain, Rogers didn't end up in the infantry or on a regular Navy vessel. Instead, he became a pilot in the United States Navy, taking to the skies at a time when aerial warfare was revolutionizing combat. And Rogers wasn't just flying planes. He also served in the Office of Naval Intelligence, posting that would later fuel countless theories about his life and ultimately his disappearance. The ONI, as it was known, was responsible for gathering and analyzing naval intelligence, protecting sensitive military information, and conducting various covert operations. What exactly Rogers did during his time there remains largely unknown, hidden behind a veil of military secrecy and conveniently lost records. What we do know, though, is that during this period, Rogers developed skills that went far beyond what you might expect from a typical naval officer. He became proficient in not just one or two, but 7 different languages.
That's pretty good.
After earning his wings and developing a passion for aviation that would stay with him long after the war, he would later become known for making regular flights between Houston and Austin, a skill that would become particularly interesting to investigators years later when they were trying to figure out how he might have escaped after the murders. But hold that thought, because we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. The thing to know for now is that this combination of technical knowledge, intelligence work, and aviation skills would shape Rogers' future in ways no one could have seen coming. His time in the Office of Naval Intelligence would later lead some to speculate about possible connections to various government agencies and covert operations. And did his wartime service set him on a path that would eventually lead to tragedy? Or did it simply give him the skills he needed to disappear when the time came?
By all accounts, Rogers was a brilliant geologist with a knack for finding gas and oil and gold.
When the war was done, Rogers then landed a position that seemed pretty perfect for his skills and education. He became a seismologist for Shell Oil, a job he would hold on to for 9 years. By all accounts, he was excellent at his work, and colleagues described him as having an uncanny talent for finding oil, gas, and gold deposits. And he was exceptional at this.
People that knew him and had worked with him on projects have said that he was a very hard worker and very bright and very good at what he did.
But here's where things start to take a darker turn. In 1957, Rogers did something that didn't make sense to anybody. Out of the blue, he just up and quit his job at Shell Oil. No explanation, no warning, and he just walked away from a successful career. He was 36 years old at the time, and this would mark the beginning of a pattern of increasingly bizarre behavior. After this, come the early 1960s, Rogers had become something of a ghost in his own life. He was living back with his parents, Fred and Edwina, in their Houston home, but living with might be stretching the definition. Despite sharing the same house, Charles rarely saw his parents, or anybody for that matter. He had developed such reclusive habits that he specifically left the home before dawn every day and would only come back under the cover of night. To make this whole situation even more strange, nobody, not even his own parents, knew what Charles did during those long hours away from home. He would slip out, presumably, to go into the city, but was he actually going to do work? No one could say for sure. Even his cousin Marvin, one of the few people who knew he existed, believed he might be working as an electrician of some sort, but could never say for certain. So a man with a degree in nuclear physics, deep military ties, and a successful career in the oil industry was now living like a phantom in his parents' house in his early 40s. Most neighbors thought Fred and Edwina lived alone, and Charles had become so good at avoiding human contact that he had essentially become invisible in his own neighborhood. And then came the strangest part of this whole story. That's the day the killings were uncovered. June 20th, 1965 was Father's Day. The summer heat in Houston was already becoming unbearable, and this would be the last day we would see Fred and Edwina Rogers alive. A few days later, Edwina's nephew, Marvin, who had been trying to reach his mom by phone since Friday, called the police because his calls just went unanswered. Day after day, he dialed their number, listening to the endless ringing on the phone. He knew something wasn't right, as it was typically loud. This was the silence of the character. So on Wednesday, June 23rd, officers Charles Villa and L.M. Barta dispatched 1815 dispatchers for the welfare check. The house sat on a quiet residential street, lined with trees and plantains. The Rogers' house, a modest 1.5-story wood frame and yellow brick structure. Officers approached the front door and knocked loudly, but no answer. They knocked again, listening intently for the sound of movement outside, and nothing but silence. Following standard procedure, they decided to walk around the property. That's when they noticed something peculiar in the back of the house. Flowers had been carefully stacked against the back door, creating what appeared to be a makeshift barricade. The strange blockade and the eerie silence prompted the officers to force their way in. As they entered, the home felt unnaturally still, the air heavy with something they couldn't quite identify. In the dining room, they found an untouched plate setting on the table, food that had been left on it, as if someone had been about to eat but never did, left in a hurry. Old newspapers were stacked throughout the house, and dirty dishes were piled in the sink, signs of life interrupted. Officer Bullock would later say he couldn't explain what made him do it. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was his years of experience, or maybe it was just fate. But nothing seemed obviously wrong at first, until he made a decision that would reveal the horrifying truth. And he opened the refrigerator. What the officer found inside was hard to look at.
I opened up a refrigerator and seeing nothing but meat stacked in the refrigerator. My partner standing next to me made the comment that he thought that somebody had butchered a hog. We didn't know it was a body until we got ready to close the refrigerator, and we could see the head down in the bottom of the vegetable bin.
Oh, that's fucked up.
It wasn't a hog. It was their limbs and pieces of torso. It was far from what the officers expected to see, and it was a total nightmare.
Investigators concluded the murders actually happened the Sunday before, on Father's Day. Edwina, savagely beaten, shot execution style. Fred Rogers' head crushed with a hammer. Eyes gouged out. Emasculated. Internal organs flushed down the sewer.
And the killer hadn't just murdered them. They had methodically dismembered the bodies in the upstairs bathroom. The level of precision in the dismemberment suggested someone with knowledge of anatomy. Organs had been flushed down the toilet, later on found in the sewer systems. The house had been thoroughly cleaned afterward, with almost no blood being found except for traces leading to Charles's bedroom. Inside that room, investigators found a blood-stained keyhole saw, but Charles Rogers himself was nowhere to be found. The investigation that followed would reveal disturbing details about the Rogers family dynamic. And Charles, despite his brilliant mind and impressive credentials, had apparently been living in a state of constant tension with his folks. The Gardeniers, a couple who would later investigate the case extensively, would uncover evidence suggesting that Fred and Edwina were far from innocent victims.
The same thing that happens with a lot of cases where parents are murdered. It goes back to child abuse.
According to their research, Fred had allegedly been abusive to Charles throughout his life, and both parents had been stealing money from their own son. They had reportedly taken out loans in his name and forged his signature on property deeds. And the house they lived in actually belonged to Charles, but Edwina had been taking out loans against it and then keeping the money. But Charles never stuck around to tell his side of the story.
Hi, Anthony.
He planned from start to finish.
Yeah.
Even though it was terrible, he succeeded.
What do you mean you have an offline screen?
As police launched a nationwide manhunt, the search for Charles would lead investigators down various paths, each more intriguing than the last.
Is that, are you seeing and say offline right now?
Others thought he might have used his pilot's license to fly himself to freedom. But with no trace of him ever being found, by 1975, 10 years after the murders, a Houston judge officially declared Charles Rogers legally dead. I don't know about you, but just because you can't find a guy doesn't mean you should let him off the hook for a double murder like this. Legally dead all but seals the deal on the case, meaning that Short of Charles walking into a police station and confessing, no law enforcer was going to go searching for a dead man. And the case might remain open technically, but that's about as cold as it can get. Which makes you wonder if perhaps that judge may have had his palm greased for that declaration. Because interestingly, going back to Charles's background in the intelligence world, in 1992, authors John Craig and Philip Rogers published a book called The Man on the Grassy Knoll. In it, they made an extraordinary claim. And Charles
Okay.
Rogers wasn't just a murderer who had disappeared. He was allegedly a CIA operative who had been involved in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
Charles Rogers was a covert agent of the CIA. He was recruited in 1956 here in Houston, at first as a contract agent. Then when he resigned from Shell, he became a full-time operative.
According to their theory, Rogers had been one of the 3 tramps arrested in Dealey Plaza after Kennedy's assassination.
The motive for killing his parents was to silence them, because we believe that his mother, at least, found out that he had been involved in the conspiracy to assassinate the president a year and a half before.
While these claims might seem far-fetched, certain aspects of Rogers' background made them intriguing. His military intelligence background, his scientific education, his ability to speak multiple languages, and his mysterious departure from Shell Oil all seem to fit the profile of someone who might have been recruited for covert operations.
Yeah, my PC just kind of froze up, by the way.
But the Gardeneers, who as mentioned spent years investigating the case, came to a different conclusion as to what Charles was up to. Well, they acknowledged that Rogers had connections to CIA contract workers through his work as a seismologist. They found no evidence that he was a CIA operative himself. But really, if they wanted to, the CIA could easily keep that evidence under wraps, so it's not saying much. Instead, they traced a different path for Rogers, saying he fled to Mexico after the murders, aided by powerful friends he had made through his ham radio hobby and his work in the oil and mining industries.
The Gardeneers traced him to Honduras, where they claim he met a gruesome death too, pickaxed to death when a business venture went south.
Like everything else in this case, these are just theories. The truth about what happened to Charles Rogers after June 23, 1965 remains as mysterious as the man himself. The house where the Icebox murders took place stood empty for years afterward. A horror like this isn't easily forgotten or looked past. In the end, it proved too much to get over, and in 1972 it was finally torn down completely. The lot remained vacant until 2000, when condominiums were built on the site. But the mystery of Charles Rogers and the Icebox murders lives on. In an age well before cell phones, before GPS tracking, before the internet and social media, a highly educated man committed one of the most gruesome murders in Texas history, and then disappeared without a trace. He managed to evade a nationwide manhunt despite having a unique background that should have made him easy to spot. Or was Charles Rogers simply a brilliant man who snapped after years of abuse and financial exploitation by his parents? Or was he a covert operative whose folks discovered something they shouldn't have? Or was he something else? We may never know the full truth about Charles or the Icebox murders. The case remains officially unsolved with Rogers as the only suspect. And sometimes the most horrifying monsters aren't made of the things in horror movies. And they're brilliant, educated people, slipping notes under doors and disappearing before dawn. But for now, the Icebox murders remain one of Houston's most infamous unsolved cases, a dark chapter in the city's history that continues to fascinate and horrify people almost 60 years later. And Charles remains a ghost, a person who stepped out of normal life and into legend, leaving behind only questions, theories, and a refrigerator full of nightmares. that's it for this week's
Damn
episode
it.
of Everytown. Hope you all enjoyed it. Check us out on Patreon for exclusive episodes each week and an entire library of 200 additional episodes. And please remember to come back next week for another episode filled with scary, strange, and mysterious stories. Because you never know. Maybe your turn will be next. The dark side. It's a case of extreme and senseless violence that remains unsolved today. A warm summer night back in 1990 had couple Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson driving out to a secluded lover's lane on the outskirts of Houston. The pair was young and in love. The following day, the road was found. Soon, it would be discovered that they had encountered somebody who terrorized them in a way that is hard to even fathom. Hey guys, it's Andrew. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Everytown. For today, we're checking out the vulnerable situation that Cheryl and Andy found themselves in, and the killer who took full advantage of that. And this individual not only cut their lives short, but he took pleasure in doing it. And despite knowing this wasn't his first time committing such a vile act, to this day the case remains one of the most mysterious ones in all of Texas. So let's head on down to Houston, dig into the Lover's Lane case, and find out who killed Cheryl and Andy. Even before cars were invented, young people sought out hidden areas for makeout sessions and probably a little more. By the 1860s, these secluded spots for getting naughty would become known as Lover's Lanes. Couples park their horse-drawn buggies, seeking privacy from prying eyes. And these places were typically visited by young couples who wanted to hide their activities because they were unmarried, which of course was heavily frowned upon then. Others used lovers' lanes as places to cheat on spouses in order to keep things on the down low. Over time, the buggies were replaced by cars. The lovers' lanes continued to attract those looking to lust. But this sinning and privacy would all come at a cost. Those lovers' lanes everywhere quickly became the target for bad individuals looking to commit all sorts of crimes. Robbery, assault, and murder. Because
I will.
their targets would have their guards down. And because they were already in a secluded spot, no one would hear them scream. And tragically, Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson are among the many who visited a lover's lane only to never return, and this is their story. Cheryl was born in Florida on October 24th of 1967 to parents Robert and Barbara. Even as a child, she was good-natured, easygoing, and always loving. Her family says it was difficult to be down whenever she was around. Her infectious laughter had a way of brightening the lives of those around her. With wavy blonde hair and blue eyes, Cheryl's cheerful demeanor continued on as she grew older. The Henrys moved to the Houston area of Texas eventually. In 1986, after graduating high school, Cheryl enrolled at Stephen F. Austin State University.
And bacon. Hell yeah.
In 1990, at 22 years old, she then returned to Houston, where she found work as an optometrist while planning for her and her sister Shane, who was 3 years younger than her, to live together. In the meantime, she was staying with her mom, and it was that summer that Cheryl met Andy. Garland Andrew Atkinson, known to his friends as just Andy, was born to parents Ann and Garland on September 6, 1968, in North Carolina. Andy's folks were young at the time. His dad was 18, his mom just 16. And shortly after his birth, the Atkinsons divorced, leaving him to be raised by his grandmother for much of his life. Despite this somewhat rocky upbringing, Andy was known to be a happy baby and child. Longing for a real sense of family, he grew up inseparable from his cousin Timmy. In 1977, Andy's father, Garland, relocated to Houston amid some legal troubles in North Carolina. Garland had gotten into trouble after accidentally shooting a man in the face during a fight that occurred at Rick's Lounge. The man survived and all charges were later dropped. It's worth noting so you understand a bit better the type of person Garland was, as it's possible come into play later on in the case. Initially, Andy moved to Houston with his dad, but he decided he didn't want to stay and quickly moved on back to North Carolina. And this was for the best, as not long after, his father found himself in trouble again with the law, and this time he was busted for dealing drugs. Garland spent the next several years in prison, where Andy made the trek to visit him once a month. Upon his release, Andy visited his father in Houston for weeks during summer break. Garland often asked Andy to move in with him permanently, but Andy wasn't interested in this as he wanted to be with his friends back on the East Coast. During these summer visits with his dad, Andy worked the door at Dream Street, a club managed by his father to earn some extra cash. Andy attended Campbell University in North Carolina for a few semesters. However, driven by a desire to connect back with his father and perhaps seeing more opportunities out there, he headed out to Houston in early June of 1990. He began working at a Gold's Gym, enrolled at the University of Houston, and was due to start classes in early September. However, tragedy would strike before that would ever happen. In early August, Andy, along with a friend, decided to catch up at one of their usual night spots, a popular place called the Yucatan Liquor Stand. That particular night, one of Andy's buddies brought along a girl he was seeing, and she, in turn, introduced her friend. And this friend was Cheryl Henry. And from their first encounter, both Cheryl and Andy were feeling the butterflies. And Cheryl didn't usually get worked up over boys, yet here she was, utterly enamored with Andy. Her sister had never seen her so blissfully happy. And Andy too fell hard, and the connection was instant. They were inseparable, each declaring the other as the one. Their bond grew fast and was seemingly unbreakable. On the night of August 22nd, the couple in love headed out on the town on a double date with Cheryl's younger sister Shane and her boyfriend. They hit up Bayou Mama, a nightclub right in the heart of Houston on South Gessner Road. And they sipped some cocktails and shared a few laughs. Shane vividly remembers the affectionate exchanges between her sister and Andy, playfully teasing them and telling them to go get a room. And at around 11:30 p.m., they did exactly that, at least sort of. After leaving the club, Cheryl and Andy set out for a secluded Lover's Lane out in West Houston, a popular rendezvous spot for young couples seeking some cheap privacy. But after that night, neither of them would ever be seen alive again. And Shane, who often drove her sister to work, stopped by her mother's house the following morning to pick Cheryl up, only to find no trace of her. Assuming she had simply stayed with Andy and had forgotten to let her know, Shane continued on with her day, brushing aside any sort of concern. But as the hours slipped away, the problems kept adding up. Cheryl failed to arrive at work altogether, which was very unlike her. Then no one could reach Andy, so by 5 p.m. on August 23rd, Cheryl's family reported her as missing to the Houston PD. Around that exact same time, a Cisco food security guard in the area of that Lover's Lane found Andy's white Honda Civic, abandoned in an isolated cul-de-sac. Initially, that security guard wasn't alarmed, but when the car was still sitting there at 8 p.m. when he made his next set of rounds, he felt the need to investigate a bit further. As he approached, he noticed the windows were rolled down, which allowed him to get a clearer look inside. And there he saw the key still sitting in the ignition, and the seats fully reclined. Scattered on the passenger's side floor were Cheryl's shoes and her purse. But what really grabbed his attention was what appeared to be some fresh bloodstains inside the vehicle. At that point, the guard contacted the police. After phoning them, he then decided to phone a number found in the purse. That number just happened to belong to Cheryl's mother, Barbara, and so she rushed to the wooded area, arriving long before the cops did. When police arrived upon checking the license plate, they learned that the vehicle belonged to Andy. Knowing the couple had been dating since last night, they knew they had a problem on their hands. Officers armed with canines commenced a thorough search of the area. Barbara was never far behind. It was just before midnight on August 23rd when a cadaver dog led them to an utterly gruesome discovery. It was Cheryl's body around 200 yards away from Andy's car. Her death was so brutally violent that officers had to restrain her mother. She was a horrific sight. Nearby, another unsettling discovery awaited. The killer had meticulously laid out Andy's golf clubs and balls from his trunk, forming a trail that pointed directly to Cheryl's location. The girl was found face down, naked, and covered with decaying cedar fence boards. Her clothing had been savagely cut away, her underwear was stuffed into the pocket of her jeans. Her hands were bound heavily behind her back with a hemp rope, and her throat had been slashed 3 times. Evidence of SA was confirmed, with DNA samples collected from her remains. The golf clubs and balls weren't the only unusual piece of evidence investigators found at the crime scene. As suspended from a tree above Cheryl's body were 4 partially deflated balloons, and lying beside her was a crisp $20 bill. It appeared that the killer had enjoyed his time out there, setting up a macabre scene, the likes of which these officers had never encountered, and he was toying with them.
I'm concealing it, but not enough that you cannot find it. In other words, I want them to be found.
The search for Andy was called off because it was just too dark, but it resumed at first light the following morning. After nearly 10 hours, they found him, bound to a tree 75 yards away from his girlfriend. And his throat had been cut so deep that he was nearly decapitated. Unlike Cheryl, Andy was discovered clothed, with his watch and money untouched. The killer's motive was clearly aimed at the victims, not their possessions, but the investigation begged the question, why did the murderers have their whereabouts? Examining the crime scene further, investigators believe that Andy willingly allowed his killer to tie him to that tree, perhaps by the threat of a gun. It was determined that the girl had been killed first, and she put up a fierce fight. That means that Andy was forced to endure the horror of hearing Cheryl's screams. Perhaps he thought they would get out of it at first if they just obeyed, but then he had to witness her murder, fully aware that he faced the same fate. At that point, completely powerless to intervene.
Green bingo thing on screen.
The worst part of it all is that they didn't have any leads whatsoever.
You just delete that, or you have to join it to be part of it.
Was in its infancy. Introduced only 5 years
And
earlier,
I'm only part of it through somebody else's stream, so.
For the DNA sample collected from Cheryl's body even to be analyzed, permission had to be explicitly granted. By September of 1990, a $10,000 reward was announced for any information that could lead to the arrest of the perpetrator. Despite investigators' relentless pursuit of every lead, fairly quickly, months turned to years without any answers. It wasn't until 2001, 11 years after the crime, that a significant development emerged. That year, the Houston Police Department received a letter claiming to have information about the murders, but they weren't looking to just be a good Samaritan and help solve the case. They were demanding $100,000 in exchange for the info.
Okay, I'll let you out of there, dude.
Later in 2004, the handwritten note read, HPD. If you want to know who killed C. Henry plus A. Atkinson, it will cost you $100,000. Reply, Houston Chronicle, personal column, Monday, 3/12/01 only. A lawyer will be hired to make sure you play straight. Postmarked March 1st of 2001, the letter arrived at the police station early that month. The police replied with an ad saying, "We do want to know what you know about Henry and Atkinson." They included a contact number, hoping for a response, yet despite their efforts, no one reached out. Was this merely a cruel hoax, an attempt at a cash grab? I mean, why wait over a decade to come forward if the sender truly had valuable information? In a desperate bid for leads, the police finally released the letter to the public in 2004, hoping someone might recognize something crucial. During the investigation up to this point, several potential suspects were identified. However, each was found innocent through DNA testing, and the letter never led anywhere. Then in 2007, all samples were retested, marking a very pivotal moment in a case that had long gone cold. Because the retest revealed that DNA evidence from semen found in Cheryl's body actually matched DNA collected in the unsolved assault of the Houston exotic dancer.
With DNA testing expensive and in its infancy, it would take 17 years before that sample was run. It turned out to be a match for Lover's Lane killer.
And this assault had occurred just 2 months prior to the murders of Cheryl and Andy, right around the time they first met. The victim, an employee at Gigi's nightclub in Houston, left work around 2 a.m. on June 20th of 1990, headed to her boyfriend's house in northwest Houston. With her boyfriend Randy, who was a pilot away traveling, she was all alone. She ate a late dinner in the living room, unaware that likely an intruder was upstairs the entire time waiting for their moment. And this man eventually emerged wearing a black fishnet stocking over his head, waving a long-barreled handgun. Unaware, the woman froze in fear, and this guy demanded to know where Randy was, claiming that he owed him money. There was a brief pause, and then the intruder attacked. He grabbed her and wrapped her wrists tight with duct tape, and then pulled $200 from her purse, her pay for working that night, and stuffed it in his pocket. He then blindfolded and gagged her, and placed a pillowcase over her head and threw her onto the bed. And taunting her, he repeatedly cocked and uncocked the gun, acting like he was about to shoot her over and over again while he committed his heinous act. Another game, just like the golf clubs and balloons from the Lover's Lane case. Before leaving, he ordered her to remain on the floor and disconnected the phone. Despite wearing the stocking over his head, the victim provided a detailed description. The attacker was described as a white male in his late 20s to mid-30s.
Yeah, you should be able to shrink that.
Black hair and an olive complexion.
Bingo screen down.
Gloves, dark shirt and dark pants.
YouTube.
A uniform of some
That's
sort.
from
His stance
something
was
else.
very forceful and military-like.
The victim helped generate this sketch of her attacker, which was also aged. Something else that stood out?
He had a very forceful military-type stance about himself.
Although DNA was collected, testing was too new and costly, delaying the analysis for 17 years, only to find it matched the DNA found on Cheryl. The similarities in each case raise many questions. Could Cheryl and Andy have known their killer, as it appeared in the case of the exotic dancer that the perpetrator knew Randy, the boyfriend? Authorities speculated that the suspect likely frequented or worked at a local strip club. And when re-interviewed, the female victim actually disclosed that she had previously worked for Andy's father at the club that he managed. So, was that just a coincidence, or was somebody perhaps out for revenge? In In May of 2008, the police released a composite sketch of the perpetrator based on the victim's description, aged to reflect how the attacker might look now. Yet despite these efforts, his identity still remains elusive. The DNA which links one individual to both crimes has not matched any profiles in any national databases, or any of the 23andMe type places either. It might be a matter of time before that happens, but also 34 years have passed, which is a long time. Today, the case remains unsolved, and the killer is still at large. And what have they been up to since then, and how has their life gone?
I'm more bothered with just knowing what happened, who did it. I'm curious what this person's been doing all their life, how they've been able to live with it every day.
And fast forward 2 years after the infamous Lover's Lane murders, to the night of August 4th of 1992. And Tammy Breckenridge, a 23-year-old waitress, vanished after leaving the men's club in Houston at around 1 a.m. The men's club was only a short distance from Bayou Mama. And Tammy had been last seen talking to the security guard at the club. Unfortunately, though, to this day, she's never been found. No arrest for her abduction and likely murder has been made. Worth noting is that many other young women have also disappeared in Harris County, many in the early 90s, and they've never been found. Several of them were in their early 20s with blonde or brown hair. They were roughly the same height and the same weight, and all vanished in the early hours of the morning. While Houston is a large area, and it is possible they aren't related, you also can't deny that perhaps they are. And maybe there is a serial killer out there that's yet to have even been identified as a serial killer. Today, Cheryl and Andy's families remain tormented by all the unanswered questions in their case. While recent breakthroughs in familial DNA have illuminated countless cold cases across Houston and beyond, they've yet to cast light on the mystery of Cheryl and Andy's murders.
So it's hard when people ask us if there's anything new, because for 33 years, there hasn't been anything new.
But somewhere out there, somebody holds the key to unraveling this sinister secret. The senseless and brutal act against Cheryl and Andy remains one of Texas's most infamous and mysterious murder cases, and is just one of many other unsolved Lover's Lane slayings. And so, be careful out there. So that's it for this week's episode of
Go to a shitty motel instead.
Remember to come back next week for another episode full of scary, strange, and mysterious stories, because you never know. Maybe your town will be next. There's murder, and then there's utter mayhem. Every once in a while, a story comes along that's so insane, the darkest of demons can only be left to blame. And today, we have 5 of them. This one's for the OG fans of the channel. There are 5 disturbing occult crimes. Number 5, House of Horrors. Sometimes neighbors can be annoying. They might be too loud, maybe their car's in your way, or you don't keep up with their lawn. Whatever it is, you might not like them all that much, but I assure you it can get much, much worse. Case in point, you could find yourself living next to someone like Pazuzu Algarad, who was a Satanist that turned his North Carolina home into a literal house of horrors. Pazuzu, whose real name is John Lawson, was born on August 12th of 1978 in San Fran, California. He changed his name when he was 23 to Pazuzu Algarad, which he stole from the main demon in the movie The Exorcist. You can see where this guy's head was at. From an early age, he had always showed signs of emotional distress and mental issues. While his mother Cynthia initially sought psychiatric help for him, financial issues eventually halted his treatment, and he was left on his own to figure it out. As a result, he turned to self-medication with various substances. And by the time he changed his name, he was becoming increasingly withdrawn from society. He wanted nothing to do with how it was set up and functioned. He did things our culture frowns upon, like only bathing once per year, as he believed that cleaning the body would weaken it. The natural oils and dirt made him strong, and similarly, he didn't brush his teeth either, and in fact, he actually filed his teeth down into sharp tips. His home at 2749 Nob Hill Drive in Clemens, North Carolina, became a sanctuary for other outcasts and those living on the fringe. Like Charles Manson, Algarad had a dark charisma that attracted misfits. Among his followers were his fiancées Amber Birch and Crystal Matlock, who were frequent visitors to his chaotic household. It was chaotic because those who visited here engaged in all sorts of dark arts. Blood rituals involving birds, rabbit sacrifices, rampant drug use, and all the other stuff that comes along with that. The house itself was disgusting. It was filled with garbage and rotting animal carcasses. Blood was smeared on the walls, adorned with satanic symbols and pentagrams. But there was also a whole lot more as well. Pazuzu would go on to be charged in 2012 with accessory after the fact of involuntary manslaughter, related to the discovery of a man named Joseph Chandler, whose body was found in a park having been shot to death. Algarad was accused of concealing information from the cops and harboring the murder suspect in the case at his home. And cops would be looking into him over the next couple of years and eventually were able to get a search warrant on his place. On October 5th of 2014, police arrested Algarad and Amber Birch after discovering skeletal remains in his backyard. And these would later be identified as Joshua Weltzer and Tommy Welch, who had vanished in 2009. And Crystal Matlock was subsequently charged in connection with one of the deaths, suspected of assisting in the burial, and both men had been shot execution style. Investigations revealed that Algarad had killed Wetzler in July of 2009, with Birch assisting in the burial, and Birch allegedly murdered Welch in October of 2009, with Algarad's help in burying the body. Not long after that, this home was declared unfit for habitation and completely demolished. Meanwhile, Amber Birch pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, armed robbery, and accessory after the fact to murder on March 9th of 2017, receiving a prison sentence of 30 to 39 years. And Crystal pled guilty to conspiracy to accessory after the fact to first-degree murder on June 5th of 2017, was sentenced to 3 to 5 years in prison. As for Pazuzu, rather than face the music, he chose the easy way out. In October of 2015, he died in his prison cell. Number 4. The Craigslist Killer Couple. Known as the Craigslist Killer, 19-year-old Miranda Barber was no ordinary teen, as together with her husband of 3 weeks, 22-year-old Elliot, they lured and killed Troy LaFerrera. On top of that, she claims to have had many more murders under her belt. Miranda had suffered a troubling childhood, of course. At 4, she was taken advantage of by her uncle, who was sent in jail for the next 14 years for the crime. 9 years later, at 13, found herself looking for some stability in her life, and she got it in a bad place. It was among a satanic cult, and here she conducted her first murder, where she shot someone who owed the cult leader some money. Miranda said she became embroiled in the cult, and at one point became pregnant, was forced into an abortion. She spent the next several years with them, where between 2008 and 2013 she was responsible for the deaths of at least 22 people. At least, that's what she claims. Though those have never been proven and law enforcement has not found the proper evidence to support it. But what did happen for certain is when she was done with the cult life, hoping to make a change, she moved on down to North Carolina. She soon met her future husband, Elliot, through a mutual friend. Since birds of a feather flock together, Elliot happened to be into Satanism too. In October of 2013, the two eloped. Miranda got fired from her job for getting caught stealing, while Elliot dropped his job as a dishwasher. They sustained themselves by having Miranda hire herself out on Craigslist as a companion, where she would get paid anywhere between $50 to $850, depending on the task at hand. Though much in denial, if you ask Elliot what she did with these guys, well, it was just deep conversations and nothing more. Looking for a new thrill and something to help bring them closer together, they decided it would be a good idea to kill one of these men. And they had several attempts but couldn't push through with it. That is until 42-year-old Troy LaFerrera came into the picture. And he responded to one of their ads, and Miranda and him met at a parking lot of a mall on November 11th. It was also Elliot's birthday. While Miranda waited for Troy, Elliot hid himself in the back seat of the car. And after Troy got in, she told him that she had just turned 16 years old, but he replied saying that he didn't care. That's when she said she knew. She gave the signal to Elliot, and he jumped out and started strangling Troy using a cord. And soon after, Miranda grabbed a knife and began stabbing Troy more than 20 times in the chest. And then dropped his body in an alley, took his wallet, got supplies to clean their car, went to a strip club to celebrate Elliot's big B-Day. Miranda said that Troy was still breathing and gasping for air when they dumped him. Police managed to track down the two soon after, and two thrill killers were arrested. On September 8th of 2014, Miranda and Elliot Barber were sentenced to life without parole, bringing a chilling end to their reign of terror. Number 3. The Fall River Murders. In the late 1970s, the blue-collar town of Fall River, Mass. became the unlikely backdrop for a series of brutal murders. And these crimes, which would go on to be linked to a satanic cult, marked the beginning of the infamous Satanic Panic era in America. If you're unaware what that era is exactly, essentially, it was sort of a mass hysteria that slowly crept into the public consciousness. The reason why was a mix of factors. Movies like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and The Omen becoming huge box office hits, heavy metal music becoming mainstream, and various articles and crimes coming forth, claiming that underneath the wonderful America we all know and love was a dark and sinister force at play. In Fall River, the horror all began on the night of October 13, 1979, with the murder of 17-year-old Doreen Levesque. A resident of New Bedford, who had left foster care, Doreen had no fixed address. She was in Fall River to work the streets. On that night, witnesses from various bars said they had seen her and that she was pretty intoxicated. The next morning, two joggers would stumble across her lifeless body under the bleachers of a local high school, where she had been assaulted and brutally bludgeoned to death. Despite a fairly in-depth investigation, no one was ever convicted of Doreen's murder. Then just a few weeks later, on November 7th, 19-year-old Barbara Raposa disappeared. A single mother with a history of abusing drugs and working the streets as well, she was reported missing by her father after she failed to pick up her son from a babysitter. She was last seen being dropped off downtown by a friend. Her body would be discovered months later, January 26th of 1980, by hunters in a wooded area on the outskirts of Fall River. The autopsy results indicated she was killed shortly after she was last seen. On February 8th, 1980, 20-year-old Karen Marsden was questioned by police as a potential witness to Doreen Levesque's murder. Fearful and refusing to identify the killer, she declined witness protection and just asked to be dropped off at a local church. The next day, she was reported missing by her grandmother, with portions of her skull then being discovered on April 13th, though her body was never fully recovered. Multiple individuals were charged in Karen's murder, but only Carl Drew and Robin Murphy were convicted. See, Carl Drew was a pimp and drug dealer who also was a satanic cult leader. He created this lifestyle to keep the people under him in line, and there were lots of them. Robin Murphy was part of his group, and she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, initially testifying that Carl orchestrated Karen's killing and that she was forced to take part in it. And this would lead to her conviction and a life sentence with the possibility of parole. Murphy was ultimately released in 2004 and later recanted her confession, claiming she only testified to ensure the other participants were jailed. Though part of her testifying is also what allowed her to get out of jail early, so that very well could be the real reason. A man named Andy Maltus, who was entangled with the whole crew of bad apples, was later convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Barbara's murder. The waters are muddied in this one as to who was actually responsible for what, but there's no question these three had done some very bad things, and probably along with some other people. The Fall River murders, which were a dark chapter in the city's history, were marked by brutality and mystery, believed to be linked to a satanic cult, and combined with everything else happening across the U.S., helped spark the satanic panic era, which still exists to a certain degree, even today. Number 2, the tragic story of Sherry Daly. The following is the heartbreaking story of Sherry Daly, loving wife and mother who was betrayed in the worst way by the very person she trusted the most in this life. Sherry was living what seemed like an idyllic life in Ventura County, California. Married to her high school sweetheart, Michael Daly, the couple would go on to have 2 sons and a white picket fence out along the beautiful West Coast. But life was good. By May 6th of 1996, the family's world turned upside down. As 35-year-old Sherry headed out to a Target to buy a Mother's Day gift and never returned. Michael, of course, reported his wife missing shortly after, and what the police found was utterly terrifying. Surveillance footage from the store's parking lot showed that Sherry had made it there, but that was also where the problem started. Because the video captured the exact moment she was handcuffed and forced into the back seat of a teal Nissan Altima by a blonde woman in a tan pantsuit posing as a security guard. After that, the car then sped off. The police found Sherry's van right where she left it, with the keys in the ignition and her personal items and purchases scattered inside. So it didn't appear like a robbery was the motive, which meant the perpetrator wanted something else. That was probably much worse. It was a trying few weeks for the family and friends of Sherry as the investigation unfolded. And sadly, on June 1st, remains would be discovered in a ravine on Canada Laga Road, and they belonged to Sherry. She would leave behind her husband and 2 children, with the autopsy revealing that she had suffered multiple fractures from blunt force trauma to her head and face. She had been stabbed in the chest 12 times, which was determined to be the cause of her violent death. And for added measure, her head had been removed too. And this type of murder, with it being so vicious, had the police on high alert.
Savage.
And as detectives dug deeper, they began to uncover a web of deceit involving Sherry's husband Michael and his mistress of 2 years, Diana Hahn. As it turns out, Michael had been having an affair with Diana, and evidence began to mount against the pair being involved in a plot to get rid of his wife once and for all. Receipts were found linking Diana to the disguise worn by the blonde woman who kidnapped Sherry, including a receipt for the tan pantsuit, so that wasn't good for them. Further digging revealed that a teal-colored Nissan Altima, similar to the one used in the abduction, had been rented under Diana's name. The rental car service then reported finding bloodstains in the back seat. Diana returned the vehicle, and so both were charged with first-degree murder. However, here's the thing. In Diana's defense, she confessed that yes, she had rented the car and bought the disguise, but then just gave it to Michael, not knowing what it was going to be used for. Diana was described as a shy and reserved lady. She was a cashier at a store, not a killer. The court argued she must be some sort of witch who can turn violent when needed and then back to the shy lady she appeared to be. In the end, though, it didn't matter what really happened. And the authorities believed that Michael and Diana conspired to murder Sherry to avoid a costly divorce and custody battle and to collect $50,000 in insurance. Diana's lawyers argued that Michael had manipulated her love for him to coerce her into committing the crime. However, the evidence was overwhelming. And both Michael and Diana were found guilty of first-degree murder and then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 1. The Grisly Tale of Blake LaBelle. Born May 8, 1981, Blake LaBelle came from a life of privilege. His father, Lorne, was a well-known Toronto real estate mogul and a Canadian Motorsport Hall of Fame inductee. His mother, Eleanor, was the heiress to Alros Products, which manufactured plastics. So with little to worry about in terms of finances, Blake looked to carve his own niche in the creative world, becoming a comic book writer and graphic novelist. In 2010, he published a novel called Syndrome, which depicted a sadistic doctor studying a serial killer. In it included graphic scenes, such as one where a man is murdered by being hung upside down and bled out. And soon, we would all see a prime example of life imitating art that would emerge in Blake's world. Ayana Kassian, originally from Ukraine, was a law graduate who immigrated to the United States in 2014, where she began pursuing a modeling career out in Hollywood. When Blake met her and was smitten, despite being married at the time, by 2015, Blake would abruptly end his marriage to Amanda Braun, and soon became engaged to Ayana. The couple then welcomed their daughter, Diana, on May 3rd of 2016, and within a couple weeks, this joyous time in their lives would turn into the ultimate nightmare. On May 24th, Ayana's mother, Olga, became worried after being unable to contact her daughter. They were close, and Ayana had her newborn, so they were talking constantly, and then all those calls just stopped. Olga contacted the police, who headed out to the West Hollywood apartment the couple was living in at the time, but when no one answered the door, they just left. And desperate at this point, Olga stood outside the apartment, yelling at Blake to open up. She even saw him look at her from a window, only to close the blind and walk away. Olga stressed that something was wrong, and so 2 days later the police fought with Blake to enter the home, but he barricaded himself in. They eventually broke the door down and entered with guns drawn, and there, Ayana's mutilated body was found lying on the bed, with Blake calmly by her side. In a twisted attempt brought on by guilt, Blake had cleaned her up with a washcloth as best he could. Ayana had been drained of her blood after suffering severe head trauma, with her scalp being completely removed. And down in the basement, they would find 11 trash bags with bloody
savage.
clothes. And prosecutors argued that the murder was driven by Blake's inability to take on the role of father. And he had jealousy and anger issues over their baby, who had taken on his wife's attention. In an attempt for power and control, well, he lost it and murdered his own wife. And the details of the crime were beyond gruesome. According to the LA County coroner, Dr. James Ryan, beyond just the scalp being removed, parts of her face had also been torn away. There were also numerous bruises and human bite marks on her head and neck. Dr. Ribe noted that Ayana had lived for at least 8 hours after sustaining these horrific injuries, a testament to the unimaginable pain she endured. In the end, it was one of the most violent murders in all of California's history. Blake was charged with murder, torture, and aggravated mayhem. He pleaded not guilty. Throughout the trial, his brother Cody was the only family member present daily. His ex-wife Amanda also attended, expressing her horror at the crime. On June 20th of 2018, Blake was convicted of first-degree murder, torture, and the aggravated mayhem. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So there were 5 disturbing occult crimes. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you want more content like this, go check out our Patreon and remember to subscribe. Posting 3 new episodes every single week, plus an additional one on Patreon and a whole library you can check out. Every town has a dark side. In court, a defendant who's fighting for their own life, even if they've taken someone else's, will try anything they can to get out of the crime they committed and convince the judge and jury of their innocence. And so, as you can imagine, there's been quite an array over the years of the tactics attempted to remain free. The Twinkie defense, for example, is one where Dan White, who assassinated San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk, had his lawyer try and prove to the people that his client was eating many, many Twinkies, which was proof that he was depressed. And because of that deep, dark feeling he had inside, he went on to commit murder. In other words, he didn't really do it. He just wasn't right in his mind. There's been those who have, of course, pleaded insanity when they weren't. And an interesting little subsection of that is the full moon defense, claiming that when the crime took place, it was a full moon and the moon can do strange things to people. And sleepwalking is another one. It wasn't the person's fault. They picked up an axe and chopped up their spouse or father, and they were just asleep the whole time, so take it easy on them. And so, in today's story, we bring you but another unique defense for a senseless killing. Only, there may be some truth to this one, depending on where you fall on the religious spectrum. And this is the devil made me do it defense, meaning our killer claims to have gotten possessed by a demon. An old, burnt-up, skinny man demon, to be exact, who took over control of his body and then forced him to kill. It's the only time ever that this defense
That's
has been
interesting.
attempted in the U.S., and whether or not it succeeded, well, stick around and find out. Hey guys, it's Andrew. Welcome to this week's episode of Every Town. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today we have a good one for you. A story that straddles 2 different genres that I'm sure you're fans of. Because on one side of this is the paranormal aspect. It's not just some crazy guy who randomly said he was possessed. There's a whole backstory and evidence to support it. And on the other side, we have a true crime murder that took place in the light of day and was extreme and violent in nature. And this is the story of David Glatzel, the boy who got possessed, and Arnie Johnson, who committed a murder seemingly out of nowhere. And their stories intertwine in what would become the first killing in Brookfield, Connecticut's 193-year history back in 1981. Arnie claims a demon got a hold of him, and after hearing the details of this case, maybe you'll agree. Brookfield, Connecticut is a town in Fairfield County. It's located in the western portion of the state, situated down in the southern foothills of the Berkshire Mountains. Up until the 1970s, it was a rather quiet town made up of old cotton and paper mills. Around them, there was the white flight exodus from the big cities all across America. A lot of people began to move up to Brookfield from New York City. As a result, real estate boomed, and suburban cul-de-sacs popped up and families moved on in. Included in that was the Glatzel family. And back in the summer of 1980, 26-year-old Debbie Glatzel was living at home in Brookfield at her mom and dad's house. However, things were about to change for her. She was planning on moving out soon with her fiance, 19-year-old Arnie Johnson. The two had found a decent home in the area to rent, but part of its affordability came at a price, and as they would go on to find out, it wasn't just monetary. This place needed to be cleaned out and fixed up a bit, so the two lovebirds got it cheap with the understanding that they would take care of that. So one muggy day that year, Arnie, Debbie, and Debbie's 12-year-old brother David headed over there to give it a good once-over. While David would rather be out with friends, I'm sure, and wasn't all that excited for the manual labor, he did want to help out his sister, who he loved, and his future brother-in-law, who he looked up to. Once they arrived, Debbie got to work in the kitchen, scraping up years' worth of burnt grime from the stove. David was dealing with the cobwebs in the living room, and David set out upstairs to see what filth awaited up there. This house was old, and the wooden stairs creaked as the young boy ascended up into the darkness of a hallway without any windows. This was the type of house that looked like its previous occupant had lived there for decades, just collecting items, and eventually became part of the overall decor. Stacks of newspapers and old magazines were piled into boxes that sat in the corners of the bedrooms, as if someday said owner may want to read that 5-year-old Time Life magazine again, even though they knew they never would. Dirt had caked itself into the cracks of the floorboards so hard that you couldn't tell where one slate ended and the next one began. A musky smell of damp dust permeated every room he stepped into. And they weren't there long before David came running downstairs in a sheer panic with claims that they weren't alone in the house. He said that an old man appeared out of nowhere, shoved him, and then threatened him. Well, Arnie, being the man of the house and wanting to prove that, did a spot check in each room up there, but no old man was hiding in the closet or under the bed. Still, David was adamant that what he saw was real. And this person, or entity, was a dark figure. It was hard to make out any real facial features, as David described him as looking skinny and burnt. This figure then pushed him onto the bed and told him that if anyone moved into this house, then bad things would happen to the family. And Debbie figured this was David's way of just trying to get out of this cleaning session, but Arnie thought it was something more than that, something sweeter. And perhaps David just didn't want his only sister to move away, and so he made up the old creepy burnt man story. A good attempt by the kid, but of course they weren't buying it. But either way, with David appearing shaken, that was it for the day. The chores were done, and Arnie and Debbie would do the rest of the cleaning on their own, so the three of them headed back home. While they may have thought that this was the end of that, it was really only the beginning, the start of a very strange string of events that would culminate in the gruesome murder of one man. Back at home, David just couldn't seem to let the thoughts of that old man from upstairs go. It was either a very elaborate attempt from him to keep his sister close by at home, or maybe there was actually something much darker going on. In the weeks that followed, David started suffering from night terrors, something he had never experienced before. These weren't just nightmares, they were more extreme, and they got to the point where he became scared to even go to sleep. The normally outgoing David now didn't want to do anything, so he became withdrawn from his schoolwork and his friends. He kept on describing what was scaring him, and through time was able to get more details. It was a man with black eyes, a thin face with animal features and jagged teeth, pointed ears, horns, and hoofs. Arnie and Debbie had continued working on their cleanup without incident, but it appeared that the old man from the house was making good on his claims of harming the family if they moved in, and he was using David to get that message across loud and clear. David's visions worsened to the point where they began happening in the daytime as well. On one occasion, the family kept calling him down for dinner. When Debbie went to find him in his room, he was just staring blankly at the wall as if stuck in a trance. The family was concerned as they tried to navigate what exactly was going on. But what really put them over the edge was when David started showing up with unexplained scratches and bruises, and claims that it was the old man who was hurting him. Debbie needed another man around, and so she had Arnie come over and stay with them for a few nights while they all took turns watching over David. If his stories were true, then if someone were there to witness it, then they could figure out what they were dealing with. And so, as he slept like watchmen on patrol, Mom, Dad, Debbie, and Arnie would take turns keeping an eye on David. It was an unsettling situation because they weren't sure what was scarier, that some entity was hurting David or, and this was more likely, that David was doing it to himself. The reality of their situation soon revealed itself when both Debbie and her mother, while on patrol, witnessed David in the night being beaten and strangled by invisible hands. David would also make disturbing sounds while in his bed, guttural growls mixed with Bible passage recitings. And he would wake up and have no recollection of what he said or sounded like. And then on top of all that, each member of the family swore to hearing someone upstairs in the attic walking around. That unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing along the creaky ceiling boards, they all heard it, and yet each time it was investigated, no one was there. And it got louder over time, as if this thing was becoming more of a presence in the house and within David. Debbie and Arnie had a Catholic priest come over to their new rental house to try and really cleanse it, hoping that they may rid young David of his issues since they started there. But it did nothing, which makes sense if the demon were attached to the boy. His visions continued on, and so at that point, they said screw it to that new rental. They weren't going to live there, so they cut the lease and were done with that place for good. They had to deal with helping David get rid of whatever it was that attached itself to him. And so they did what anybody in the 1980s living in Connecticut would do in their situation. They reached out to longtime fellow residents and world-famous paranormal investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren, to assist in the matter. The Warrens came to Glatzel's home and at first just observed so they could wrap their heads around the situation. And soon they experienced exactly what the family had. Footsteps in the attic, David's animalistic screams and wounds, courtesy of the old man. They watched the boy suffer through violent spasms and convulsions. They would go on to conduct a series of 3 lesser exorcisms, meaning without a priest, in an attempt to release David from this demon. And all 3 of these were terrifying for everyone involved, to say the least, as they witnessed David levitate and at one point stop breathing for a brief time as well. David would gargle and yell profanities at his family as the exorcisms occurred, and he spoke about the murder that was going to happen in a short time, but of course, no one knew in that moment exactly what he was referencing. The Glatzels were extremely stressed while these played out over the course of a few weeks. Each time it would appear that he may be okay, and then some days later it would come back with a vengeance. During the third one, Amidst the family's wails of terror, Arnie had seen enough. He stepped forward, demanding that the demon possess him instead of the boy, saying, "Take me on. Leave my little buddy alone." All those who were present at that moment claimed to have actually witnessed the demonic transference, or at least see a black mist emanate out of David and disperse. Lorraine said she saw it enter Arnie, and at that point, her hands were tied. A demon can take time to grab a hold of someone, especially an older person who's not a child. And you can't fight off what you can't see, so in order to rid Arnie of the demon, he'd need to show signs of possession. The Warrens told the family to call them if anything else happened. A few days later, David finally appeared to be doing better, to the relief of everyone. His face came back with a youthful glow. The bruising stopped, and his visions were no more. And so, all was right with the world again, at least for a few weeks. Debbie was working at the Brookfield boarding kennel, where she groomed dogs for a living at this time. Her boss, 40-year-old Alan Bono, had watched her go through this trying time with her family, and even though he wasn't sure how to take it exactly, believe whether or not her little brother was actually possessed, he saw it took a toll on her. She was stressed about the situation and had lost her rental house in the process. And so Alan, being a kind-hearted man, offered her a discount on a small rental property that he owned really close to the kennel, and it was basically next door. That was a plus, and with David on the mend, Debbie was eager to get back on track and out of that house, so in late 1980, she and Arnie moved on in. But over the next few months, something in Arnie was changing, and he himself said he never felt right. Debbie witnessed it too and caught him in the living room one day staring off into space, much like she had seen her brother, but Arnie was able to convince her that he was just fine. Denial is a powerful thing. Having gone through the ordeal with David, maybe it was just too much for them to think that it could happen again. Arnie certainly didn't want to believe that perhaps the old man demon had become part of him, and so he hid it, pushed it down as best he could. And just like in the movies, when a person's been bitten by a zombie but doesn't want to tell the rest of the group about it, they hide it as long as they can, even though they know the inevitable is coming. In early 1981, one day while driving home from work, Arnie said that finally this entity got a real hold on him, and for the first time he felt out of control. On an isolated road, it forced him to jerk the wheel right into a tree, but luckily, Arnie walked away unharmed. Now you may think that if this story is in fact real, then this demon was probably trying to kill him. However, that didn't appear to be the case. After all, it had spent some time digging its heels into the man, and so why waste all that work? Now, this demon didn't want to kill Arnie. It was just looking to make itself stronger. Because just a few days later, Arnie found himself driving back to the old house they almost rented out where all this started. Whether he did this on his own accord or the entity inside him forced him there is anyone's guess. But once at the property, he headed out back to an old well, as if drawn to it for reasons unknown. Staring down into its blackness, it was here that he encountered the demon itself in full force. He locked eyes with it down in the well that day, and after that, nothing would be the same. Arnie felt it. He was no longer the good, kind-hearted young man everyone knew him to be. He was the demon. It had taken over, and he was now fully possessed. February 16th of 1981 was the day it all went down. Arnie had called in sick from his job at Right Tree Service, and he just felt like doing something else that day. With his sister Wanda and Debbie's 9-year-old cousin Mary, the three headed over to hang out with Debbie at her job for a bit, while she worked brushing out the dogs and so Debbie could pet the animals. Bono, Debbie's boss and landlord at this point, was there for the day, and for lunch decided to take them all out to a local pizza joint. And it was here that the first sign of trouble crept in, as Bono was said to have drank a decent amount of beers to the point where he started having some loose lips. It was nothing crazy, but loose lips sink ships, and it was enough to annoy Arnie, where he told him to relax. The two had a minor exchange of words, and the tension was building. When they all returned to the kennel after, the words continued, until eventually an argument broke out between Bono and Arnie. And Debbie at that point tried to take her little cousin out of there before anything bad went down, and that's when Bono reportedly grabbed the little girl and refused to let her go. In his mind, perhaps he thought he was playing, but this infuriated Arnie, who looked down at the ground before letting out a deep and loud growl like some sort of possessed animal. It was so odd that it broke all the talking back and forth. It was in that brief moment of silence that Arnie pulled out a 5-inch pocket knife and attacked Bono right there on the spot, viciously stabbing and screaming the whole time. Wanda tried to pull him off, and Debbie tried to help separate them, but Arnie was way too overpowering, and there was no stopping him. Within less than a minute, Bono had been stabbed 20 times, mainly in the chest and stomach. A few times, the blade pierced the man's heart, and while Bono would be rushed to the hospital, within a few hours, he unfortunately passed away. The coroner said that 4 or 5 of the blows were utterly devastating, hitting Bono's vital organs, and there was one slice that went from his heart all the way down to his belly. Arnie would soon be apprehended about 2 miles away after an attempt to flee the scene. Sergeant Gordon Fairchild of the Brookfield PD was there on scene, and he said that Arnie told him he didn't mean to hurt anyone, and that he was unable to remember anything. Down in the local jailhouse while in custody is when word came back that Bono had in fact passed away. Arnie then spoke in complete gibberish for a few minutes before he just fell asleep in his cell for the next half hour. When he awoke, he would go on to be charged with first-degree murder officially, and this weird story would mark the first murder ever in Brookfield's 193-year history. The day after the killing, Lorraine Warren informed the police that Arnie hadn't done this himself, that he was in fact possessed, and she told them the story. The trial that eventually followed captivated the world's attention, as the defendant's lawyer boldly claimed that the accused was possessed by demons at the time of the killing. The judge, however, cited the lack of empirical evidence and deemed their defense impossible to prove in the court of law, so that was quickly dismissed. As a result, Johnson was found guilty of first-degree manslaughter and then sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. But he actually got out early due to good behavior and only served just under 5 years. While in prison, the convicted killer received an education and got married to Debbie. And life for him and David eventually went back to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after this. As to why the demon decided to leave Arnie is anyone's guess. The most logical explanation is, of course, that he was never possessed in the first place. That the timing was just right when he lost his temper with Bono and decided to try and get out of it with the devil made me do it plea. It could be that after this killing, the demon was satisfied and so it up and moved on. Or perhaps, since Arnie and Debbie never did move into that old house, then the old demon kept its word and eventually left them alone. So that's it for this week's episode of Everytown. Thanks for tuning in today, and please do subscribe and click the notifications so we can reach you with more content that we're putting out each and every week. Remember to come back soon for another episode filled with scary, strange, and mysterious stories, because you never know. Maybe your town will be next.
Ricky!
Every town has its share of mysteries, but few compare to the chilling confessions of Robert Charles Brown, a man who claims to have killed nearly 50 people. On the surface, Brown's life seemed pretty unremarkable. A military man with a checkered past, eventually leading to his conviction for 2 murders. And yet, his later confessions painted a far more sinister picture, one that's left investigators and the public looking for answers and verification over the details of his crime. His arrest in 1995 for the murder of Heather Church was really just the beginning. While serving his sentence, he began sending cryptic letters to the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, claiming responsibility for numerous other killings.
The intrigue surrounding his claims has elevated his status among true crime people and law enforcement, making Robert one of the most infamous persons of interest in modern American crime. And either he's telling the truth, or that's exactly what he's been searching for: notoriety and power. Robert Brown was born on October 31st, 1952, in Coushatta, Louisiana, the youngest of 9 children. His family, led by his father, who ironically later became a deputy sheriff, was well regarded in the community. But from a young age, Brown was no stranger to tragedy, or even a senseless death. It's not impossible to connect his disregard for human life with the horrific way his maternal grandfather decided to leave this world, by weighing down his body with a heavy chain and ultimately drowning in a cistern. Despite the darkness hanging over the family and a history of depression on his mother's side, Brown exhibited signs of intelligence, particularly in math, though he was also a loner, notorious for his short temper. His school years were middle of the road, leading him to drop out just before his 17th birthday to join the Army. He then served 2 tours in Vietnam and 1 in South Korea, but his military career ended in disgrace with a drug-related dishonorable discharge in 1976. Returning to civilian life, Brown drifted through various dead-end jobs across Louisiana, Texas, and Colorado. He delivered flowers and clerked at a convenience store and held various other menial jobs. His personal life was as tumultuous as his work life was mundane. He married 5 times, with each wife describing escalating patterns of abuse and irrational behavior. Clearly, Robert's path had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and it was only getting worse. Before his infamous murder convictions, Brown's criminal activities painted a picture of a petty thief rather than a serial killer. His early offenses included car theft in Louisiana, a bizarre arrest warrant in 1981 for stealing a church bell, and a 1986 conviction for stealing a pickup truck. Police reports also linked him to various drug charges, burglaries, and arsons, alongside troubling incidents of animal cruelty. Despite these red flags, Brown remained under the radar of law enforcement for the most part, his violent tendencies masked by a guy who was just kind of dumb, someone who couldn't stop committing misdemeanors. In 1991, though, this man's true dark nature would finally come to light. On September 17th of 1991, 13-year-old Heather Church was abducted from her home in Black Forest, Colorado, while she was babysitting her younger brother. Despite extensive searches and national media attention, including features on America's Most Wanted, Heather wouldn't be discovered until 2 years later. A camper was looking for a place to settle down for the night when he stumbled upon her remains not too far from Rampart Range Road. The cause of death was clear due to the multiple skull fractures. It was blunt force trauma to the head. Most importantly, though, 3 fingerprints were discovered back at her house on a window screen that didn't belong to any family or friends, so it was believed they belonged to the killer. Those prints were run through several databases all around the country when finally, almost 2 years after Church was discovered, on March 28th of 1995, Brown was arrested for the murder when his fingerprints were matched to a conviction he had back in Louisiana. He avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty to the girl's killing and was then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While this conviction was certainly a victory for law enforcement, little did they know of the madness about to come. Because during his incarceration, Brown then began a confusing correspondence with the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. And he taunted them with strange statements like,
7 sacred virgins entombed side by side. Those less worthy are scattered wide. The score is you 1, the other team 48.
Hinting at his claim of nearly 50 murders in total. His written revelations would lead to another conviction in 2006 for the 1987 murder of Rocio Sperry, a 15-year-old who disappeared after going to the movies and whose remains were never found. And Brown claimed to have dismembered her body and scattered the pieces out in the woods. And he knew details of the case that had not been printed in the papers or broadcast on the news, such as the type of car she had been driving. The same car that was later found abandoned in a random parking lot, which Brown used to drive her to those woods. But these two confirmed murders were just the tip of the iceberg, because Brown's letters described a killing spree that spanned several states and decades, painting a picture of a man driven by a twisted sense of morality. He claimed that most of his crimes involved victims of low moral value, whom he opportunistically killed in motels and other transient settings. His methods were varied and brutal, including strangulation, stabbing, and shooting, making him one of the most perplexing serial killers in criminal history, as typically they enjoy a very specific way to dispatch their victims. One of the more disturbing aspects of Brown's confessions, and perhaps one of the reasons authorities found it hard to imagine he was lying, was his meticulous recollection of all the killings he did. He was able to provide detailed accounts, including dates, locations, and methods, and even drew a map indicating the number of victims in each state. According to this map, he claimed to have killed 17 people in Louisiana, 9 in Colorado, 7 in Texas, and others in states like California, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Despite these detailed confessions, while some do point to the fact that he's telling the truth of his involvement, many of Brown's claims remain unverified to this day. His admissions included specifics like pushing a victim off a cliff or using ant killer, which contained chloroform, to subdue another. But the lack of hard physical evidence has led to there being a shadow of a doubt, and so unfortunately for the victims' families, that looks like how it will remain. Brown is already behind bars for life and is never getting out, which is a good thing, but in terms of nailing down another 47 or 48 murder charges against him from cold case files, well, that's unlikely. There's also a real chance that Brown has exaggerated his number of victims, possibly seeking attention or just to toy with authorities, since he needs to find some way to spend his time in prison. Nevertheless, Brown's confessions were enough to secure another life sentence for the murder of Rocio Sperry. His letters and interactions with investigators, notably with retired FBI agent Charlie Hess, who coaxed out his confessions through years of correspondence, provide a chilling insight into the mind of a man who, despite his boasts, remains a mystery in many respects. Beyond the possibility that he simply wanted to gain notoriety or manipulate law enforcement, a tactic not uncommon among serial killers seeking attention, another theory posits that Brown's confessions were partly true, but that he embellished his stories to create a more fearsome persona. Some investigators believe that Brown's confessions might have just been an attempt to gain leverage or favorable treatment while in prison. By claiming involvement in multiple unsolved cases, Brown ensured he remained a person of interest, which could have influenced his conditions in prison or provided a psychological edge over guards and investigators, while also getting him clout and feared status by other inmates. Yet the most messed up possibility of all this is that Brown's confessions might have been driven by a genuine need to unburden himself, and that so many people really did suffer such awful fates for merely having been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Serial killers often exhibit a complex mix of guilt, pride, and a desire for recognition. Brown's detailed confessions, combined with his willingness to correspond extensively with investigators, suggest that he may have been motivated by a combination of these factors. What remains crystal clear is that Brown's case is complex. Investigating any serial killer is, let alone when they throw up a giant amount of claims. In the end, it's just hard to distinguish between fact and fiction when dealing with confessions from culprits who are often simultaneously mentally gifted and deranged. And their minds don't really work like a regular person. But let's not allow Brown's messy web of confusion to distract us from his profound impact on the families of his alleged victims and the communities involved. And for the families, Brown's claims brought a mix of hope and despair. And hope because there was finally a chance to uncover the truth about their loved one's fate, and despair because many of these confessions lacked the evidence needed to bring closure. For these families, Brown's claims have only served to layer chaos and frustration atop their unresolved grief. And the communities across multiple states were left reeling from Brown's revelations. The possibility that a serial killer had been active in their world for decades without detection was a chilling thought, to say the least. And public reactions ranged from heightened fear and suspicion to frustration at the perceived failures of law enforcement to connect the dots sooner. As of right now, Robert Brown is serving his life sentences at the Lemon Correctional Facility in Colorado. At 71 years old, he has 2 confirmed murder convictions, is strongly suspected in at least 9 others, and his claims, of course, are that he has 49 victims in total. His life in jail has been marked by continued interactions with investigators, whom he occasionally tantalizes with new details and confessions. Are they real memories or just a carrot on a stick? It's very hard to know for sure. But his story is a grim reminder of the darkest side of human nature and the complex challenges in bringing all serial killers to justice. So there were the life and crimes of Robert Charles Brown. I hope you enjoyed the episode today, and if you want more darker content, go check us out on Patreon. It's free to try, and there's an entire library of strange stories you can dig into, plus new ones coming out each week. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll see you guys in the next one.
Mm. Be.
Every town has a dark side. The word cursed and haunted gets thrown around a lot. We like to think of places such as old homes and buildings, even dolls, as harbingers for restless spirits and dark poltergeists that can make things go bump in the night. And some of the stories are entertaining, others frightening. But once you dig deep enough, for the majority of them, you can find logical explanations. However, when you dig down into the depths of one specific place down south, no matter how hard you try and explain it away as logical, the data just doesn't back you up. Because the vast man-made Lake Lanier in Georgia, in its nearly 70 years of existence, is a body of water that has claimed close to 1,000 lives. It is an imposing and mysterious lake where people keep dying and disappearing, each tale getting weirder than the next. And and you find out what lies beneath it. Well, for some reason, all the tragedies and strange occurrences just start to make sense. Hey guys, it's Andrew, and thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Everytown, where today we're looking into a handful of the many stories that have occurred on Lake Lanier's waters, ones that are the reason this place is widely considered the most haunted body of water in all the land. So, let's head on down to Georgia and discover Lake Lanier, the most cursed lake in America. Located about an hour's drive north of Atlanta, with an area of more than 500 square miles and a winding shoreline that stretches for more than 1,000 miles, Lake Lanier has an interesting past. Unlike the majority of the country's bodies of water that form naturally, Lanier is a man-made reservoir, which was little more than an idea back in the 1940s. Up until that time, the region where the water sits now was a complex of lush and fertile lands where wildlife thrived and numerous rural communities with names like Castleberry Bottom and Oscarville flourished. These farmlands were home to hundreds of farming families, most of whom were black, who had occupied the region there for generations. In the early 1950s, however, the government decided to step in and change the landscape forever. Atlanta was growing, and so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers were brought in, needing to find a source of power and water for the population, something that would remain sustainable for the needs of the future population. There were only so many options to choose from. This reservoir, for one, needed to be close to the area it served, and two, they needed a natural water source to pull from. And so, the project was then conceived on paper. They would use the waters of the Chattahoochee River, which originated in the Blue Ridge Mountains in the north of the country, and build a dam that would then flood the land and become wonderful Lake Lanier. In order to carry out the project, the government had to buy the land of all the people and farmers that would be displaced at a good and fair price. Whether or not they got that is up for debate. A lot of these families that sold weren't too wise on the ups and downs of the real estate market. In 1948, for example, 81-year-old Henry Shadeburn would be the first to sell his 100-acre farm to the United States to the tune of $4,100. Think about what 100 acres an hour outside a major city is worth today. Pretty sure if you own that, you'd be a multi-millionaire. But in today's dollars, that $4,100 is the equivalent of $54,000. So they fell a little short in that department. And Henry's story wasn't unique. On top of that, the residents found it hard to put a price on all the memories and deep roots they had in the area. There was a lot of resentment, anger, and confusion, because to a lot of these people, the land their families had grown up on was priceless. But the government has its way of getting people to do things they don't want to. It would take another 7 years or so, but eventually, by 1956, some 700 families had sold a total of 56,000 acres of land to the government. The Buford Dam was built, and soon waters flooded over the lands, burying people's memories forever. And Lake Lanier came to be. And today, at first glance, most people don't think about the past, as Lake Lanier presents a beautiful and imposing spectacle to virtually everyone of the hundreds of thousands of people who visit it each year. However, little exploration beneath the surface reveals a much more disturbing picture. In In order to prepare the land that would become the lake, the Army Corps of Engineers undertook the task of removing and demolishing anything that could become a hazard to future boaters and swimmers. Every type of wooden structure that could float, like barns and entire houses, was demolished and removed, but they didn't get everything. As the government can sometimes tend to do, they cut corners to save some money. And so rather than get rid of the small town of Oscarville, they just decided to flood it. And so right now, at this very moment, it remains underwater. Many homes, 6 churches, and approximately 20 cemeteries were just left alone. At first, they got away with this, but over time, people began to notice. And in a classic sort of do first and ask permission later, eventually the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came back and removed numerous marked graves and relocated them to safe areas. But they admit they may have left some behind. On top of that, they were just talking about the actual gravestones being moved. The bodies buried there, hundreds of them, are still under the water. And so this is why many people consider this lake haunted. The frequent sightings of strange figures in the water, unexplained accidents, cars losing control, boats crashing into non-existent obstacles, and many other incidents are the work of restless spirits trapped beneath the lake. And whether you believe in spirits and hauntings or not, there's no denying that this lake is one of the most deadly bodies of water in the United States. In its entire history, there have been over 700 deaths here, which, compared to the national average, is well above what would be considered normal and just accidents.
I'm gonna call it a day right there. We are gonna go raid. Who you gonna call? Ghostbusters. Who is on? Almost. Perfect. You know what? I'm gonna send everybody over to dirt. I am tired. I'm gonna lay down. Probably fall asleep, dirt. Think. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for chilling with me. I really appreciate you guys hanging in there. Especially after everything froze up. Don't know what the hell caused that, but hey, thanks for being here and chilling with me for a while. Enjoy Dirt Stream for a bit, and I will see you all tomorrow or tonight, depending on how you want to look at it. But at the end of the day, remember, just a game. Have some fun with it. Good night, everybody. Bye.